That is a real challenge. And to ask, what makes you sad? What makes you happy? And to be able to know. And Stendhal is saying, as is the rabbi through his comments, that unless you know that, you really don't know somebody. And so we held as part of a strategy this summer, and my time is nearly up, but let me just tell you a little bit about it. Focus groups in Tennessee. And what those focus groups taught us is a number of things. Now, there's a report. I asked my colleagues here if I could distribute it. And they said, no, there will be 120, 150 people here, and you really probably don't need to do that, Richard, but maybe you can summarize it. But 2 focus groups were held in May, one in Knoxville at the New Harvest Church of God, led by Tony Ritchie. Thank you, Tony. And the other at First Baptist Church in Greensboro. Is Robert here? Anyway, each group gathered for a period of approximately 4 hours to discuss Islam, national security, and Christian-Muslim relations. And the consequences of these faith group meetings were some conclusions. And among those conclusions, one of the common themes was that, yes, we agree as pastors, they were pastor leaders, that as evangelicals, we must love our neighbor. And that they wanted more interaction with Muslims. And so to learn these principles of love, forgiveness, and grace, they believed these were the entry points that would justify creating personal relationships with Muslims and their communities. So there was a lot of interest. Tony, would you agree? A very positive interest in finding common ground with Muslims. But, as per the earlier data, number 2, under the experience and views of the Muslim community, only 2 of the pastors maintained strong relationships with members of the Muslim community. All agreed this lack of interaction proved problematic in their efforts to understand the mainstream Islam. And they voiced frustration that the only portrayal of Islam in their congregations was through press where Islam was addressed in relation to terrorist attacks. That's how their congregants were understanding Islam. And so pastors believe there's a clear American conservative and progressive narrative relating to Islam, but they feel called to move beyond these pre-selected buckets. But these focus groups were especially wary, I should say this, to pronounce a religiously universalistic viewpoint that abandons conviction of Christianity or differences between Christianity and Islam. So they requested resources and messaging that would help them to be more inclusive without giving up the claim of Christian soteriological truth. Many of them are soteriological exclusivists. But they do agree, as one said, quote, we have to be able to name Jesus as Lord, but without vitriol against non-Christians. We have to hold interfaith dialogue, but without neutering Christianity. So the vision, I would suggest to you, is this. And it is happening, and it can be done. The strategy is through that kind of engagement. And so a local imam came and met with us in lunch just a few weeks ago. And a local scholar, she's here, where met with us as well. And so I happen to think that this engagement that also goes further, because I'm a public policy kind of guy, to hold, you see, by these various participants that torture isn't effective. That there are public policy understandings as well that these men and women can come to when they better understand what the vision is, what a strategy for engagement is, and lastly, some good tactics. I have to say the tactic is really as follows. It comes from my work on climate. I don't deny that. I openly say this because I think there's a relationship. What has happened on this issue politically is that what were the hot button issues of the religious right, abortion and prayer in schools and same-sex marriage, quite different today, have been replaced by other issues like climate. And I would suggest to you that the more increasing one is this one, of Muslims, as they say, the Muslim, those who are in our country, in field training for whatever purpose this questioner put to Trump. Obviously someone who had animus toward those who are Muslims. But there are millions of others who listen to this and go, yes, and that's why Trump wouldn't respond. You know that. He's not going to offend the voters he thinks he needs. And so our last tactic has to be to confront. I really believe that. And so we have to move people in the pews, as I would say on climate, from disinterest to deliberation to design to doing and defending. From I want or I won't engage on this issue to I might engage on the Muslim-Christian dialogue issue to will, yes I will, that's design. And doing, I am doing this and then I'm going to defend it, which I will and do and have right here today defended this kind of dialogue. That's the progression. It's a transactional thinking process. And psychologists say that sometimes it takes 7 years for people to move from I won't to I might. I got that from neurologists. Nobel laureate, in fact. And so we have to both engage with people. Lastly, since my time is almost out, let me say this. What I've also learned is that in this matter of tactics, which I say requires being bold, but it also requires addressing fears. And being a diplomat, having some sense of where you begin and end and where others in your life end. It's the capacity, they say, to get outside the emotional climate of the day. It's being willing to be exposed and vulnerable. That word vulnerable again. One's imagination will be limited if you're afraid of standing out. It's not just the fear of criticism, it's the fear of standing alone. This is what all the psychological tests show. That the reason people won't change their minds is because they're afraid of standing alone. Judith Shulevitz, who is a writer for the New Republic, she says, sometimes democracy is less a matter of thinking well than choosing your friends well. And remember, she also says, decision-making and risk assessment aren't essentially rational. And so what we know from the climate debate and other issues that you see that have replaced, the prayer in schools and some of the other debates that have riven our religious communities, is that scientific facts don't rule. Scientific facts don't dissuade denialists at all. And so our challenge is not to produce more facts and more information. I think Dr. Madsen will talk about this afternoon. It's not to produce that. It's to not even to produce better narratives, but to understand how those facts and narratives will translate across social barriers. And we need to present the evidence in ways that's effective and does not convey animosity, contempt, or hostility. And so diplomacy is far more effective than trying to debunk bad science or even bad theology. Diplomacy, and that's what you'll be learning today. Let me tell one last story. When I first came to Washington in 1980, I had the rare privilege of befriending two people. One was probably the greatest theologian for evangelicals in the 20th century. His name was Carl F.H., which stood for Ferdinand Howard Henry. He wrote God, Revelation, and Authority. His books were legion. And the other was his co-companion when they were both editors of Christianity Today magazine, Frank Gableline. And Frank was editing the Expositor's Bible Commentary series at the time, an incredible work, both aged men. And I had the rare privilege of being in their homes. And for a while, when Frank was ill, my wife-to-be actually cared for him. But this is the story that was told, first by Henry, and then by his son, Paul Henry, who was a congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who died early in life of a brain tumor. Some of you may know, in his mere 40s, but he was heralded by David Broder and others at the time as more qualified to be president in the long run, speaking now of Paul Henry, than was Gerald Ford, who came from the same 5th Congressional District of Grand Rapids. But the story was told about King Darius. You know the story. The story I would like to rephrase in closing, just like I would like to rephrase the story of the Good Samaritan, to learn it from another perspective. It's not the perspective from Daniel, who was an advisor to Darius. When the satraps who were jealous of Daniel, whom the king, by the way, intended to put over the entire kingdom, devised a plan that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. That was, you see, the agreement that Darius signed off on. And so then when you see Daniel continued in his prayer, diplomats do that. They really do pray about these things. Darius had to make a choice. And Henry told the story. And then the younger Henry told the story. He was actually a politician, not a theologian. And he said the king really had two choices: to save his friend Daniel and sacrifice the kingdom. Because you see, if he reversed himself, he would be shown to be less than divine and off with his head. And so he had two choices: save his friend Daniel, his advisor, and sacrifice the kingdom, or save the kingdom and sacrifice his friend. You follow the choice? It's what Edward John Carnell at Fuller University Seminary called the tragic moral choice. And our politicians and others in places in leadership and others continually face this challenge. And we do, at times, in the choices we make. The very difficult choices, the outcomes of which we don't always know. Daniel, he chose to pray and to suffer the consequences. He chose, in effect, to speak out. It wasn't simply, verbally. It was by his actions he chose to be faithful to the call. And he ended up in the lion's den, and the king had a choice, and he didn't save him. God saved him. And the end of the story, you see, is that Darius said to Daniel, "May your God whom you serve, be glorified." And Daniel, in respect to the king, said, "Oh, you king, live forever." What a diplomat. What a diplomat. And that is what we are called to be. Recognizing, you see, that what we have been given, this challenge, to be our neighbor's friends, is what God has given us. There was a time, Aaron told me to tell the story, where I had said, through the public newsletter of the association that I worked for, shortly after 9/11, the reason we have this is because we worship two different gods. And a woman wrote to me, I said, God, not the tribal God. I wasn't into Jerry Falwellism of America, but I did believe in the universal God of the Bible, and I was suggesting that there was this difference between this God and all of them. And she wrote me a letter, and she said, "That's simply the word for God in its own. What are you doing by your language?" She chided me. I changed my mind. I would simply close by uttering the words of one of the Wesleys, John, I believe: "To serve the present age my calling to fulfill, oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. Arm me with jealous care, and as in thy sight to live, and oh, thy servant plead, prepare a strict account to give." We have to say to the politicians, to those in our congregations, to our friends and others, there will be an account to give. And what he has called us to be and do is to be that neighbor, both receiving and giving. Thank you very much.